I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking at the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Howard Husock, Vice President for Policy Research here at the Manhattan Institute. Welcome to the presentation and discussion of the new report, The Economic Opportunities of Shale Energy Development, published by the Institute's Center for Energy Policy and the Environment. You know, not long ago, the Marcellus Shale was at best an obscure rock formation known mainly to geologists. It was not the center of discussion of America's energy future and the prospects for revival of the upstate New York economy. Things have changed, and pretty dramatically. The natural gas deposits of the Marcellus and other regions in New York State are part of vast, newly accessible reserves, which some say hold the promise of helping America realize the long elusive goal of energy independence, as well as reducing the carbon emissions associated with those forms of energy that shale gas may replace. But the techniques associated with tapping those deposits, particularly the drilling technique as hydraulic fracturing, have without doubt become a major new focus of environmental concern, to the point that New York State has imposed a moratorium on new such drilling, and the State Attorney General last week sued the federal government asking that it be required to conduct a full environmental review of proposed regulations to allow natural gas drilling. Such concerns notwithstanding, the International Energy Agency just yesterday released a report predicting that we are about to enter a new golden age of natural gas. So, how then do the benefits of shale drilling, especially as regards job creation, compare with its costs? That's the question which lies at the heart of the presentation by our two speakers today. Economist Timothy Considine of the University of Wyoming is the co-author of our paper, The Economic Opportunities of Shale Energy Development, which specifically compares costs and benefits as they affect parts of New York State currently subject to that drilling moratorium, especially as regards employment, as I said. Also with us this morning, to be available during the question and answer period, is Professor Considine's co-author, Robert Watson, Associate Professor Emeritus of Petroleum and Natural Gas Engineering at Penn State, as well as the chairman of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Oil and Gas Technical Advisory Board. After Professor Considine summarizes the report findings, he'll be followed by a distinguished public official who himself had to strike that regulatory balance on the matter of shale drilling, and did so in a manner which has brought tens of thousands of new jobs to his state of Pennsylvania. Former Pennsylvania Governor Edward G. Rendell is, if I might, one of those Democrats who truly does keep working people uppermost in his priorities, and who has always understood that that implies the need for strong economic growth. Currently a partner in the Philadelphia office of Ballard Spahr LLP, Mr. Rendell served 2 terms as governor of the Keystone State, as well as 2 terms as mayor of the city of Philadelphia. He served as well as chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and I should add, in 1993, as the Riston Lecturer here at the Manhattan Institute. We will begin our program with Professor Considine.
Thank you, and good afternoon. What I'd like to do today is just briefly outline the report, our major findings, and as Howard mentioned, the focus of the report is in comparing the economic benefits of shale energy development with the environmental costs. In the second section of the report, we look at the emergence of shale energy. Shale natural gas production is now approaching 20% of total U.S. production, so it's here to stay. Also noteworthy is the emergence of shale plays not only in North America but around the world. So this is a big development. And of all the shale plays, the one just to our west is perhaps the largest, the Marcellus. And when you include the Utica and Upper Devonian shales, we could have a reserve base that could very well be the largest natural gas field in the world. Now, in mineral economics, there's a principle that there's a resource triangle. On the top of the triangle are high-grade resources that were developed in Neolithic times. Miners in Switzerland were mining copper ore of 20% grade. And on the bottom is low-grade resources. And as you go down the bottom of the resource pyramid, technology improves. And this shale development is a great example of that, advancing in technology. There are two technologies in shale development, directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing, that are the techniques for unlocking these huge reserves of natural gas and also oil. Now, the production, the economics of shale energy production is unique, and it all ties to the production decline curve. In a typical shale well, production declines about 50% in the first 3 years of production and then plateaus at some level. What that means is that for companies to maintain their production or increase output, they have to keep drilling. So natural gas drilling becomes very similar to manufacturing. And this is why for resource plays like the Marcellus with a very large resource base, you're looking at development that could last decades or longer. So it's hard to get your mind around this, but that's what we have. Another important element, two important other elements to the economic impacts is that shale energy development requires a lot of materials like sand, water, sand and gravel for building roads, and engineering and construction services, and all sorts of equipment. Economies like New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that have a long legacy of manufacturing are right there to develop, to supply those goods and services, the shale drilling. And this is a big stimulus to local economies. And then secondly, another element of, another factor of production in shale energy development is land. You need land. And even though the footprint of any individual well is small, you need a lot of land because the aerial extent of the deposit is so large. So this means that natural gas companies are spending billions of dollars on something called lease and bonus payments. These are payments to landowners to access the minerals. And then once the production ensues or begins, the companies pay royalties. And what do people do with this money? They save some of it and they spend it. So you go around northern Pennsylvania, you see a lot of new pickup trucks, and you know the parking lots are full at Unimarts and so on. And this is just all this re-spending that's going on. Now, one of the unique aspects of our report is that not only do we explain these economic benefits, we compare them with the environmental costs. And to do that, there's basically a few steps that you have to follow. And the first is get the facts, okay? And what we did in the report is we looked at the environmental records of violation filed by the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania over the past 3 years. And we tallied up all these violations. We then, based on the data from the violations, estimated the impacts on air, water, and land resources. And then we tapped into the economic literature on the valuation of environmental amenities. My colleagues out at the University of Wyoming have pioneered this field. Fellows like Tom Crocker, who invented the idea of marketable permits, is one of my colleagues. And I use their data on the value of forest land and the value of clean air to put a dollar estimate on these environmental costs associated with shale energy development. What did I find? I found that the total environmental costs were much less than the environmental benefits. And the gap between the two was much larger than I anticipated. I went back and I checked my numbers. I, made even more conservative assumptions about value, and it didn't even close the gap very much, okay? So the basic finding is that when you compare the costs and benefits, the economic benefits of shale energy development far exceed the environmental costs. And this raises another important point about how we view energy and the environment. Many authors of reports that have looked at greenhouse gas emissions or toxic air pollutions, they kind of focus on one aspect. But in economics, we try to weigh all the costs and benefits. And when you do that, I find the results compelling in the favor of development of shale energy resources. Now, what are the implications for New York? New York, in particular, has two shale plays that could come into production. The first is the Marcellus. And what I do in the report is I develop a scenario for developing the Marcellus in upstate New York. And this involves an analogy with what is going on in the northeastern counties of Pennsylvania, Susquehanna, Bradford, and Tioga. I look at their record and I say, okay, well, if this goes north of the border, here's the track for drilling that could occur over the next 10 years. And then I calculate the economic benefits of that development and find that they're well in excess of $11 billion in value added. Also, this economic activity generates more than almost $1.5 billion of tax revenues and about 15,000 to 18,000 more jobs per year. And that's quite significant. But I view that scenario as rather conservative because there's another shale play receiving a lot of scrutiny right now and a lot of study, and that's called the Utica Shale. And the Utica Shale extends well into, well, it extends to the Canadian border. So everything west of the Adirondack, Catskill area is Utica or Marcellus. So it's a very large resource play. And if that is developed, you're looking at numbers, you're looking at, after 10 years, more than 100,000 jobs. And 50 to 80 billion dollars in economic impact and much higher tax revenues. So this is there's a lot at stake. I think the opportunities are very significant, and I'm sure this report will set off other studies where they attempt to balance the environmental costs and economic benefits, and I welcome that analysis because I think that's the way we should be looking at these issues. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by saying that if Governor Cuomo were to ask me my advice about lifting the moratorium, I would tell him the moratorium should be lifted. There's too much of an upside here for New York, as there was for Pennsylvania, and too much of an upside for America. If this is done right, and that's an important caveat, and I endorse the findings in Professor Considine's report with another important caveat, if this is done right, the upside is enormous. You heard the professor talk about land valuation. Well, we had farmers in all parts of Pennsylvania who assumed that they were going to die poor and have nothing to give to their families. And all of a sudden, because of the Marcellus Shale, that image that they had became incorrect. And they have a source of income that it makes them anything but poor, not necessarily rich, but anything but poor, and gives them something valuable to pass on to their sons and daughters. Secondly, the shale play does help local property tax. There's no question about that. Thirdly, the overall economy of the state. The professor was talking about the different things like sand and the different things that have to be produced and manufactured. Professor, you didn't talk about steel. Steel goes into all those drills, and the strongest advocate for the shale industry in Pennsylvania outside of the companies themselves is John Surma, who is the CEO of U.S. Steel. John is a very strong advocate for expanding the shale drilling. And then, of course, there's jobs itself. The job figures, Pennsylvania has done very well comparatively to all other industrial states. Our unemployment rate for the end of the last month that the state statistics were available was 7.5%, at a time when the national rate was 9.0% and when most industrial states were higher than the national average. That lower unemployment rate and the fact that Pennsylvania year to year is the third highest creator of jobs, only behind Texas and California, that is attributable in part to shale drilling. Our Department of Labor estimates that of the 107,000 jobs that were created in Pennsylvania month to month over the course of a year, 7,500 of them were either direct shale jobs, on-the-site jobs, or jobs at factories that were related to shale. And there's a Penn State study that also uses the figure for Pennsylvania of 100,000 potential jobs down the road. So the upside economically for a state is enormous. For the people of the state is significant. But I think almost more importantly is the desperate need we have as a country to be energy independent. We're never going to get our economy back on track to produce the type of growth that we need to balance our budget. We're never going to do that unless we can become energy independent. As long as our balance of trade payments is skewed so badly by the fact that we import so much oil, we're never going to straighten it out. And we have the chance to be energy independent. Natural gas has so many uses. It can certainly replace oil and petroleum in cars. It is about 50% less polluting than oil in cars. It is abundantly available in the United States. Some have said we're the Saudi Arabia of coal, and it is ours. The jobs are ours. The benefits are ours. The taxes accrue directly to us, to our local and state governments, and it is something we desperately need. Were I to be President of the United States, and it is something I have absolutely no interest in, were I to be President of the United States, I would bring every state, every city, every county, the federal government itself, Verizon, Comcast, every major corporation that has a fleet, and say, gentlemen, we're all going to convert to natural gas over the next 3 or 4 years. That would do more for our economy. It would do more for our balance of payments. It would do more for our environment than almost anything we can do. And we set up a distribution. You don't have to have a distribution center at every gas station because you're talking about fleets. You have to have distribution available, but not necessarily everywhere that gasoline is available. So start from the premise that I am a strong believer in this, and I have put my actions behind that. When the Marcellus Shale started to be drilled, I supported it. When my own party wanted to tax the drillers in year one, I said no. I said this is an industry that for Pennsylvania is in its infancy. Yes, we do need an extraction tax down the road. Every other state has one, but not now. Let's give them a chance to grow and chance to breathe. We've been supportive in so many different ways. And I think there are members of the industry that are very responsible and understand the balance that's necessary between the environment and the economic growth. But in Pennsylvania, I think the industry is close to killing the golden goose. They're going to get good support from the legislature and from Governor Corbett, who I think unwisely promised that there would be no shale tax. That has been a cause of hate and loathing directed at the shale companies because Pennsylvania, like many other states, is cutting things, laying off people, reducing full-day kindergarten, things like that. And everyone who's getting cut, every advocacy group that's seen their program getting cut, says, well, why are you cutting us and you're giving Exxon and British Gas and Shell free. We're the only state in the union that doesn't have extraction tax. The fear and loathing that's bubbling up in Pennsylvania towards the shale drilling could be stopped easily by paying a fair and reasonable tax, which the shale companies are used to paying in every other state in the union. It makes no sense, and I have told them that over and over and over again. Secondly, there are significant environmental violations. In the report issued by Professor Considine, I think he found that there were 10,000 gallons of water, 10,000 gallons of water contaminated by the wastewater that comes from the fracking process. Now, he was quick to point out that 10 million gallons of water, 10 million gallons. Now, Professor Considine was quick to point out that Pennsylvania households use 300 billion gallons in a year, but 10 million gallons of contaminated water, by anybody's reckoning, is not a minor problem. It is not a minor problem. Last year, there were over 1,200 violations of shale drilling companies. 1,200 violations. Some of those violations were minor, but as Professor Considine's report says, in a 3-year total of 1,900 violations, 7.9% of them were serious. Well, do the math. 7.9% of 1,900 means there were 170 serious violations. Do you know what one serious violation does in the minds of the people of a county and the minds of the people in the surrounding county, and with our media today, in the minds of people in the entire state? What happened in Dimmock, where Cabot Oil eventually paid $4.1 million in a settlement that was really brokered by the state DEP, in a settlement to a very small number of homeowners, the entire groundwater was polluted with methane, and it turned out they weren't responsible for methane, but for other significant contaminants. And those families had to have, what were they called, water horses? Water buffaloes. Water buffaloes, and they're still getting their water from water buffaloes today. So each of these incidents creates an atmosphere that's so bad that the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is important because it governs the water that flows into southeast Pennsylvania, is about to ban any frack water disposal into any of the waterways that come down to southeast Pennsylvania. And I know the equivalent of the Delaware River Basin Commission in New York is worried about that. Truth be told, there's less treated water, and in Pennsylvania, by regulation, water has to be treated for TDS down to the 500 milligrams per liter ratio, so it is safe. But the truth is that there's actually less water, less polluted water, or water that's been treated, being put into our surface waterways now than there was before Marcellus shale drilling started in 2005. Why? Because what happens, and I think most of you understand the process, but very, very quickly, with the water is necessary. Water and chemicals are injected down into the shale to break it up. It's absolutely necessary. It's the only way you're going to untrap the gas. And that water and chemicals obviously gets recycled. About a third of it comes up above ground. 2/3 of it stays way below any aquifer, thousands of feet below. That's not the problem. The problem is the water that comes back up. It is polluted. There are chemicals in it. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. It has to be taken care of. Some companies put it in plastic-lined pits while they're figuring out what to do with it. Those plastic-lined pits are very inefficient, and there is often leakage and seepage. There is technology that will essentially line those pits with something totally different that's almost 100% guaranteed not to break or not to allow seepage, and we have seen very little interest in that being adopted by the firms. Most of the wastewater is treated at treatment plants, and that means the water has to be, the frack water it's called, has to be trucked to a treatment plant. Sometimes those are nearby, sometimes they're not so nearby. Professor Considine's report says one of the big causes of spillage in Pennsylvania has been truck accidents, because where the truck overturns, that contaminated water goes right into the groundwater. So it's a problem. The reason that right now major companies are not putting any of the frack water into surface waterways in Pennsylvania, as Professor Considine found, is they're trucking it to Ohio, which I guess, as former governor of Pennsylvania, ought to be all right with me, but I don't know what's going on in Ohio. But the answer really to that problem, and it is a significant problem because you can treat it, and our DEP believes, and I believe because I trust the people who were secretaries of DEP. I had two strong environmentalists, Katie McGinney and John Hanger, as my secretaries. They said once the water is treated adequately, there is no harm to surface waters by putting it into the water. But the long run thing that will resolve this problem is technology. And there are a number of people, GE specifically, that are working on a process that will allow the water, the frack water, to be treated on site and to remove the chemicals on site so it can have a beneficial reuse right on site and treated so effectively that it could even be put back into the drinking water system. And I think that technology is close to happening because there's so much riding on dealing with that problem. The second problem, so the frack water is problem one. The second problem comes from well construction. Well construction has been haphazard at best in Pennsylvania. And I was surprised to find that the Exxons and the BGs and the Ranges and the Chesapeakes, the responsible companies, they don't do the drilling themselves. They contract out to drillers. Some drillers are more careful than others. But when the drillers aren't careful, we have seen in Pennsylvania 4 or 5 horrendous visuals where literally flames burst into the air 75, 125 feet high and remain burning for 16 hours until crews had to be flown up from Texas who knew how to put them out. Well, imagine what the citizens think of that. The citizens don't view that as a minor incident. The citizens don't do cost-benefit analysis. What the flaw, the caveat with Professor Considine's report is, no citizen in Pennsylvania is going to do a pure economic metric when gauging the benefits of shale drilling against the costs environmentally. Citizens don't view the cost environmentally. That's not what concerns them. What concerns them is the water their kids are drinking. What concerns them is methane getting into the air. Right now, the air pollution is a huge problem from drilling, and particularly because so many of the wells are in northeast Pennsylvania. Northeast Pennsylvania is a non-attainment area under EPA rules. It may not be able to take significant drilling into the air. The EPA may come and just close it down because of that. So my point is, nobody has more riding on this. State governments do themselves because the economic uptick, what it will do for manufacturing, as Professor points out, are considerable. It's one of the real things that can drive the economy, and New York should go down this path because it's so important and the upside is so great. But we've got to use care in every way, and it shouldn't be just the State Department of Environmental Protection that's exercising that oversight and care. It ought to be the companies themselves. When you have seen the dollars that Exxon put in to buy the shale play that it bought, the dollars that BG put in, the dollars that Shell put in, what Chesapeake and Range have riding, the upsides to these companies. When I was arguing for a shale tax, we used a Range, it's funny my law firm now represents Range, but Range made an SEC filing saying, and this was in the height of the recession, saying that they expected a 62% return on shale drilling. And I would, wave the SEC report. I actually didn't have the SEC report, but I'd say, here's the SEC report, 62% return, and these guys say they can't pay taxes? So the companies themselves, I went down to Houston while I was governor to speak to the Natural Gas Association and deliver the message. You are sitting on the golden goose. The golden goose is ready to hatch golden egg after golden egg after golden egg. But not us, not the regulators. We're not going to kill the golden goose. You are. So this is a good path to go down, but everyone has to be concerned about making sure we do it in an environmentally sensitive, in an environmentally friendly way, in a way that minimizes and mitigates environmental damage. 10 million gallons of contaminated water is 10 million gallons too much. Thank you all.
And our geologist, Bob Watson, engineer, petroleum engineer, all available to field questions on any or all parts of this. So, yes, Michael Myers. And usual ground rules, identify yourself and keep it short in the form of a question, please.
I'm Michael Myers. I'm Executive Director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. With respect to the governor's caveat, if this thing is done right, he proposes we do it. But my question is, what are the safeguards and the penalties against violations? And is there a difference between violations and accidents in terms of environmental impact? And if the governor is right, if you need technology, why not have a moratorium until you have that technology to prevent accidents?
Pennsylvania. Is this on? Okay. Pennsylvania passed, both regulations were started by my administration. One was passed in 2011. Passed two regulations. One on well construction, very, very important. Sets out specific parameters for well construction, which are crucially important. And two on the treatment of by TDSs of biosolids. Very, very important to pass those regulations. And if New York doesn't have those in place, I would say pass them before you start. There's no reason not to. You need some regulatory teeth, and then you need a strong regulatory body. The one thing that the drillers did agree to, we have added by charging a fee, we've added over 100 inspectors who do nothing but oversee and regulate shale drilling operations in Pennsylvania. Do you want to?
I think you did a pretty good job. But,
Hang on. Let me just introduce Harry Weiss, who is the governor's law partner.
right, and I'm an environmental lawyer by training. The other thing you have to remember about Pennsylvania, particularly when you compare it to New York and you compare it to Maryland's even more an extraordinary example. As a lawyer, Maryland only has one oil and gas case in its history. Pennsylvania was the original oil and gas state. You have in place, or had in place, an infrastructure of regulation, laws, and management of this for years and years and years. This, it also, in my view, points out the issue that the governor brought up. We've been dealing with this for years, and for instance, there was no fracking in the Gulf of Mexico, but yet we had one of the worst oil and gas disasters in our history. I think fracking, the focus on fracking takes the light off where it needs to be focused on, and that's just doing it right. I grew up in Wayne County, Pennsylvania, and to a person in that county, which will face oil and gas development shortly, all they want is it to be done right. They're not against it. It has to be done right. And no amount of regulation, no amount of government oversight is going to ensure that it's going to be done right. And that's why maybe we don't have the system in place in this country or the world, but we do have to rely to a certain degree on industry to do things right. It is in their interests, and it is the right thing to do.
Hang on.
There are different between violations and accidents in terms of environmental
The question
impact.
is about penalties. I don't. Do you want to speak to that?
Just real quickly, because Cabot on the Dimmick case was fined $1 million. Chesapeake just paid $1 million for an explosion. There are significant fines available in Pennsylvania. New York should enact that same scheme.
Thank you. Yes. Additional questions? Yes. Right in the middle there in the blue shirt. Wait for the microphone, please.
Just following up on that line of thought. So how you look at the costs and benefits of this. There's certainly a lot of benefits, and there's certainly costs, both externalities and regulatory costs and tax costs. And they flow to different people. So while you can say that it's overall a great benefit on the cost-benefit side, those benefits may flow. I mean, how do you balance where those benefits flow, especially if someone's getting a 60% return on equity? That's a huge benefit, and maybe not the right benefit. So address how do you look at that? Because saying the cost-benefit is positive simply isn't good enough. And then the second thing is, okay, all right.
Okay, our analysis looked at the economic impacts, including value added that's created and the flow of wages and salaries to the general economy. We did not break down the impacts by income class, for instance. We didn't have any explicit measures of equity in or income distribution in our analysis. So that's all I can comment on.
I believe that we have to have a significant severance tax to make sure that benefits flow universally to the state. For example, the counties in Pennsylvania are bitching loudly because they have tremendous costs. The trucks that come in and out are destroying local roads, not state roads, but local roads. They have tremendous costs in upkeep, tremendous cost in various other areas. So the legislature was working on an extraction tax that would give a third of it back to the counties to defray their costs. So you're right. The benefits accrue to a lot of people, but the costs accrue to everybody, and we've got to find a way to smooth that out. And the way to do it is a significant severance tax.
What are typical wages paid in this industry, though, Tim? Do you want to address that?
Yes. There's a recent Pennsylvania report from the Labor Department that indicated the average wage was substantially higher, about $60,000 per year, compared to the average of about $35,000. One thing another point I'd like to make is if you look at where Marcellus development is occurring in Pennsylvania, it's primarily in the low-income, previously low-income, high unemployment rate counties in the southwest of Pennsylvania and the northeast. So in some sense, the development is bringing up those communities that were previously quite economically depressed.
I think that
I wanted to get into the scope and likelihood of future regulations, both on the state and federal level. And there's been a lot of talk recently, what's better, have the states do this themselves or have the EPA come in and do, a more science-based regulatory approach. What's your take on that? And how can you talk about quantifying it in terms of cost at all? I mean, how much cost are these regulations going to add?
Let me respond to that first. As far as cost of regulations, that was another thing that the severance tax is supposed to defray. Severance tax would take care of the counties, would take care of the additional costs above and beyond the fee they pay for the inspectors, additional costs to the state regulatory agencies, and the rest of the money was going to go into what we call in Pennsylvania the Environmental Stewardship Fund, which desperately needs replenishing to help in other environmental causes as well and challenges that the state faces. Your first question was involving EPA. Right now, it appears that the courts are taking the position, and I think regrettably correctly so, that the 2005 Energy Act that President Bush and the Congress passed took away from the federal government the ability to regulate this. EPA Administrator Jackson is taking the position that they can enforce under the Clean Water Act, but it's very, very ambiguous whether EPA has any power at all. They're going to probably seek from the Congress the power to do so, and you might say, well, that'll never get through the Republican Congress. Maybe, but remember what Professor Considine said. Interestingly, where the people who are in an uproar about environmental challenges are not in Democratic areas. They're in Republican areas, rural Republican areas. And those congressmen will hear and are hearing it from their rural Republican constituents that we want something done to protect our environment.
We have a question from E.J. McMahon, director of our Empire Center in Albany.
Thank you, Howard. Governor, you talked about how you had suggested a significant severance tax in Pennsylvania now that the industry is up and running. Could you go in a little more detail about what level is that? How much would it raise for Pennsylvania? How's it calibrated per cubic foot basis or something? And how does that compare to other states? I mean, I won't get into the calibration is not important, but
I proposed the same as West Virginia, and I had spoke to Governor Manchin. He was governor then; he's now senator. When we were starting this debate, and I said, Joe, when you imposed the severance tax, was there any decrease in permit applications? He said, no, they kept going up and up and up. It's a significant tax. It would yield Pennsylvania somewhere between $300 and $400 million a year. So as they say, not chopped liver, right? A very significant tax. And it was, in my judgment, something the industry could pay. Now, the industry is benefiting by each 6 months we delay, because you heard Professor Considine say correctly, 50% of the gas is extracted in the first 3 years. So if we wait 3 years before we enact it, they've gotten tax-free 50% of the extraction. So we better get on our horse, and it's going to be interesting what happens this month in the Pennsylvania legislature, because everybody is screaming about an extraction tax.
Yes, other questions? The gentleman on the left here, yes. You wait for the microphone, please. Here it comes.
Actually, Governor, I'm looking at it from a global perspective, because I've been listening in on you, Zaritsky from Colombia. Eastern Europe is actually looking into the same thing in order not to be dependent on Gazprom as much, on shale gas, Ukraine, Poland, parts of Eastern Germany, and so on. Question is, you had already started with that, with the infrastructure and the taxing of the system, how it, not taxing in that sense, but it taxes the infrastructure. Does it also tax, to some extent, the agricultural capabilities of a state? You're looking at 3 states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, that are significant dairy farming states. Does the impact of using that much land start impacting on other industries that are as vital to the industry, to the state?
Answer quickly is yes, agriculture is concerned. Any pollution of the groundwater can affect agriculture, agricultural products. No ifs, ands, and buts about it. Most of the drilling is in counties that have a substantial agriculture component to them, and there's no question that it's a legitimate issue. But again, the same reasons that we need to police it, we'll police it for agriculture as well.
Yes. The average footprint of a well is about 3 to 4 acres, and most of the wells in Pennsylvania are located in forested regions. So that may be unique to Pennsylvania, but I think, as the governor mentioned, it's the risk of water contamination that may lead to lower agricultural output. But the land issue, I don't think, is that severe.
Well, hang on a second. If I might, I'd like to take the chair's prerogative to bring in our co-author, Mr. Watson. Why don't you come on up here, too? Well, maybe that's logistically, too. Well, you can just stand right there. Okay, we'll get him through. Because I'd love, because you've been involved in environmental regulation in Pennsylvania as well as everything else, I'd love to get your take on the governor's observation that this has got to be done right and maybe industry is going too slow. How optimistic or pessimistic are you that industry is getting it right?
Well, being a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, we can begin from there.
Well, I think he's an Eagles fan, so now we're really in trouble.
Well, that's what I was going to make the comparison between a team that does it right and the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm just kidding. In terms of the regulations that became law, that were initiated by Governor Rendell's administration, I had the privilege of being appointed by Governor Rendell to the technical advisory board that assisted in the development of those regulations. And in my opinion, they were absolutely needed. There was no question in my mind that the regulatory framework that had worked very successfully in Pennsylvania for years and years and years just did not meet the demands and the requirements of this new industry. And don't kid yourself, this is a brand new industry. The techniques in terms of technology, the materials, the demands on the environment, the demands on the water, and et cetera, in Pennsylvania has changed by several orders of magnitude because of the Marcellus Shale development. Now, having said that, I think that the regulatory framework that we have is strong. It's, in my opinion, a beginning place, because like every other industry that we've seen developed in Pennsylvania, for that matter, the northeastern part of the United States, the regulatory framework will need to evolve as we discover things. The one thing that, and again, this is not to criticize what Governor Rendell has said, the learning curve for the industries that developed the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania was just as steep as the learning curve for the citizens and the administration in dealing with the Marcellus Shale itself. There were situations that were encountered that nobody, and including myself, I've been drilling wells that penetrated the Marcellus Shale since about 1965. We never expected to see some of the things we saw, and the industry has responded in kind to changing their techniques. Now, in terms of whether or not I see the industry evolving, I think that Governor Rendell would agree with me, and I would agree with him, that we have some very, very, very good players. We do. We have excellent operators that have really moved beyond the regulations that we have set forth. But like any team, we have some losers too. And I think that that's the problem that we deal with in every industry. And that's why the regulatory framework and the number of inspectors that we have are absolutely necessary.
Does that answer your question? That was great. That was great. Additional questions? Yes, sir, right down here.
My name's Jack Cox. I'm with the Communications Institute in Los Angeles. They gave me a pass to come into New York, so it's all right. I got a question for the governor. Last week, the California State Senate voted 36-0 to require cost accounting for renewable energy resources because apparently they're beginning to realize they're not getting the buyback on it. There's been a real focus on renewable energy. You've made a very strong case today for natural gas. Do you think that we're moving in a public policy process where we're beginning to take a more careful look at really what is the short and long-term energy resources that the country is going to need to meet its energy needs?
Sure. I'm a strong believer in renewable energy. I think we've got to do more wind, solar. We've certainly got to find a way to do more hydro. Canada gets 50% of its electricity from hydro. We have every bit as many waterways as Canada. We get, I think, 7% of our electricity from hydro. We've got to unlock all of our renewables. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be cost effective right away. That's an industry that has to be nurtured as it grows. And as it grows in scale, it'll come down in cost. So in the meantime, we've got to do something else. And we need an overall portfolio. And yes, I think we need to lay the groundwork for more, but of course, safer nuclear expansion. We've got to do some more oil drilling. We certainly have to unlock natural gas. I think this is an area where Democrats and Republicans could actually get together. We're not going to agree on cap and trade until after the election, if then. But we can get together and pass enough initiatives. There's a Natural Gas Act that's a standalone right now, which ought to be passed. It's very, very important to the continued development of this industry that can do so much for America. But I'd wrap the Natural Gas Act into a bill that has something for nuclear, has an awful lot for renewables, develops a nationwide energy portfolio standard. We have it in 28 states. We need it across the nation. That makes the tax credits for renewables permanent. It does an awful lot of different things. We ought to pass that type of bill, and we ought to pass it now, not wait till after the election. This is the whole ball of wax, in my judgment, for the country economically and in so many different ways. And we've got to use every resource we have. Boone Pickens is right. Renewables, if they are going to help us significantly, they're going to help us significantly in 2025 at the earliest. In the meantime, we need to take advantage of this. Boone Pickens couldn't be more dead on. Absolutely.
Time for one more question. Harry Lewis.
Governor, I actually have family in northeastern Pennsylvania who own farms and they are getting royalties now from. I'm sorry? They actually own farmland and they are getting royalties now from some of these gas companies. They tell me, this is anecdotal, but they tell me their complaints are mostly about the heavy trucks tearing up the roads and local infrastructure, and at the moment the companies are not apparently paying the counties for that kind of repair, but that seems to be their issue. Their wells were properly drilled, apparently properly installed, and they are doing much better economically than they were for many, many years in those areas, which this is a very, very impoverished area. My understanding is that Governor Cuomo has to make a decision about lifting this moratorium in New York within the next month, is it? In the next month or two?
I think it's unclear. The Assembly voted yesterday to extend the moratorium, so I think that for another
Let me ask the panel, is it your opinion that this moratorium should be lifted in New York based upon Pennsylvania's experience?
started that way, but you want
I've answered it. I think it should.
Yeah, what you want to?
Of course. I mean, and again, I'm not trying to put words in Governor Rendell's mouth, but the thing that's interesting to note is that Pennsylvania, during the month of December, if my information is correct, produced more gas than it consumed. That's the first time that's happened.
Pennsylvania is energy independent.
Pennsylvania, in terms of natural gas, is energy independent. It was. And if you think about it from an exporter's perspective, by New York State not taking advantage of its natural gas resources, we have a great market for Pennsylvania. And that's terrible. New York, in my opinion, should move ahead and develop it. I mean, the thing that I don't understand about New York, and believe me, I'm not a Giants fan, Jets fan, Yankees fan, Mets fan, so there's a lot of things I don't understand. But the thing was, New York was second in terms of developing oil and gas. The first shale gas well ever produced was in New York State. And I don't understand why there's been such an objection to this development.
On that note, I think we can thank our panel, Governor Rendell, Professor Considine, Professor Watson. Thanks to everybody for joining us.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.